I talk a lot on Strip Panel Naked about ways that comics guide the reader, or lead the eye, or build up the page turns in ways that are designed to keep you invested in the story being told. That all does hinge though on the premise and idea that the comic book is not trying to disrupt the storytelling flow it's built. So this week I wanted to take a look at a fairly mainstream title from Marvel Comics that says a big loud no to that idea and wants to take you on a different journey as a reader. You're watching Strip Panel Naked, I'm Haas this week with a bit of a cold, and I'm going to show you some of the cool stuff lurking in the pages of some of the best comics. Okay, so before I speak specifically about this comic issue, I just kind of want to talk a little bit about storytelling and suspension of disbelief, sort of generally. So predominantly when we are reading a story, or a novel or prose, or a comic, or even watching a film or a TV show, we're being asked to suspend disbelief. And what that means is kind of accept the story that we're seeing as real in some way. No matter how fantastical it is, no matter how many demons or dragons or superheroes or supervillains are in it, we're being asked by those stories to buy into that world and buy into those characters and feel some kind of emotion towards the story and the people involved in it. That's the kind of standard stuff as a storyteller that you want from an audience. And primarily, one of the main things that you do very purposefully is not make an audience aware that they're watching or reading something, because it then changes the experience. And when we read a story, we're being sucked into the world as a non-active viewer. We go from start to finish, and we get shown a series of events. But there are other ways to do that, there are other ways to tell a story. And in Mockingbird number 8, which is the final issue of that series, by Chelsea Cain, Kate Niemczek, Rachel Rosenberg and Joe Caramagna, it's a story that shows you another way. Because here, Cain, Niemczek and the team aren't bothered about making you suspend disbelief and sit back and read and have that frictionless start-to-finish experience. They're actually asking you a little bit to become more of an active participant in their story. You've kind of seen similar stuff before, probably most notably in something like Deadpool, either the film or the comic, where the central character is aware he's in a story, and he's constantly making reference to that fact. That's breaking the fourth wall. That's the creators saying to the audience, we know that this is not real. And Cain does use an element of that in her storytelling, but it's actually a little bit different because it feels like it's much more along the lines of you being told a story by someone. And that gets to a little hidden lie that's kind of at the heart of a lot of big two superhero comics, where they've got these caption boxes and the character's kind of explaining something to you under the guise of it being their thoughts. Think Spider-Man. And the lie there is that they're talking to you as a reader. Because obviously they aren't, they can't be. They can't be acknowledging that you even exist, or that whole charade just falls apart. But what Cain does is make the Mockingbird world accept that there is someone on the other end of those captions, you the reader. But they treat it more as a friend telling you a story. It's not that this is a comic book and you're a reader of that comic book, it's that this is one person telling you a story and here it sort of ends up being visualized. That's a really long-winded explanation and hopefully not too confusing, but it should get across quite the difference between the fourth wall approach, the regular frictionless storytelling approach, and what Cain and team are kind of doing with this. Because once Cain has established that's the situation, that's the way they're telling the story, it actually allows her and the team a lot more flexibility in what they can do with that story and the way they can tell you that story. And it gives the narrative a way to move that traditionally you wouldn't be able to get away with. So we get our first example of it quite early on in issue 8, where Bobby's ex, Phantom Rider, possesses a man behind her in the crowd. There's an arrow pointing to him, a bit of explanation text, and later on down the page you've got these two panels. I guess they count as panels, I think that they would count as panels, right? With Kazar and Phantom Rider. Now, these exist on a different level of storytelling than the first and second panels, right? Because those first and second panels, they take place now, as part of the ongoing story that we're sort of seeing unfold, and the two panels here exist away from that, on a different plane of the storytelling, and the arrow and text kind of exists somewhere else as well. But it doesn't disrupt the story, it blends well, primarily because it's not being jarring, and that's always the key thing. I talk about frictionless storytelling earlier, and that's all about not being jarring, it's about having a smooth ride, and this actually ends up blending those two approaches. Because if we look at the overall information on the page, it's telling us that Bobby is on board a ship, an ex has possessed someone on the ship, and she used to have some kinky exes. We haven't been thrown out some exciting action point to be given a bit of this side story, so we don't mind the change in storytelling here, because it is all contributing to the same point. It also helps that the main portion of this change, the shots of Phantom and Kazar, they take place at the end of the page. And I think that's probably the most exciting thing for me when I read this, and probably the key to it working so effectively. Because by leaving it as the last thing before a page ends, it's not disrupting anything mid-narrative as far as the page is concerned. And we see that a lot throughout this book in most of the cases where this thing happens. A little later there's a page with Bobby showing some hidden signals to get everyone around her ready, and again, it's placed at the very bottom of the page. When you read a comic like Giant Days, for example, it gives me a great sense that comic pages can be used as sort of soft resets when that page is turned. Alan Moore famously had a habit of using them as scene breaks, and here Cain seems to be using them in a similar way, almost combining again those two approaches. By accepting that the page turn is going to cause a necessary break in the illusion of the story, it's a perfect place to have some more fun with the storytelling elements. Later again in the book, we get the Ghost Cowboy Stalker X plan flowchart, and it appears in its own page. It really might seem like such a small point to say that everything appears like this, but it shows how in a comic you get opportunities to essentially clean reset what you're doing, and that's such a strong idea. In a novel, it might be that you take a new chapter break, but here Cain and team are able to just throw in very non-comic book elements, like flowcharts and dance move diagrams, and throw them into the story, and then let you turn the page and reset the whole thing back to how it was. I've talked before in episodes about page turns being used as blind spots. You know, they're great for horror moments, for example, but this shows how you can use them to just play around with the actual storytelling. Because you can do fun stuff like this, get someone to turn the page, and then all of a sudden it's back to normal and we can carry on with the story. Because we're already going to break the illusion with the page turn, so to play around with something just before the page turn gives you a bit of leniency in breaking that illusion. It's actually an incredibly powerful tool as a concept, because you can see that there's a certain freedom in manipulation and style that it raises as an idea and as a concept in comics. It means that comics don't have to necessarily be as linear, even when they're telling a pretty linear and standard story as they do here in the pages of Mockingbird. But by extrapolating out that idea of page resets, you can bring in some elements that might traditionally feel like they take an audience out of the story and instead keep them within it while still having fun with the way you tell it. That's the thing that most surprised me about this book, was its playfulness, and I think there's some really clever lessons to be learned about the mainstream comic form and what you can do with it, and especially about the idea of pages as soft resets. I think there's a lot to take away from that. Thanks for watching. Strip Pile Naked continues to exist in this form thanks to the amazing support from the patrons who pledge support for the channel in return for new exclusive content every week. I'd love it if you checked out the page and considered supporting. For more comics talk and analysis, you can find me on Twitter at HassanOE, and finally hit subscribe to keep up to date with all the latest videos, and we'll see you next time.